Ending Hunger Now is a new book from UN Global Ambassador on Hunger George McGovern, former Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole, and theologian Donald Messer. They spoke about it Thursday at the National Press Club in Washington for about 45 minutes.
I'm David Beckman. I'm the president of Bread for the World, which is a Christian citizens movement against hunger. George McGovern and Bob Dole. Actually, my wife said to me last night, it's sort of weird that you're introducing George McGovern and Bob Dole. She said, like, not needing introduction. They have been important leaders in our nation's life on many issues, but they have worked together for hungry people for more than 30 years. They are the architects of this nation's nutrition programs, and they continue to work to defend and improve those programs, and also to provide nutrition assistance to hungry kids all over the world. The efforts of Bob Dole and George McGovern have provided food to hundreds of millions of hungry people. That is literally the truth. This new book is a wonderful resource, I think, especially for people of faith, local religious congregations. And I was just saying to Senator McGovern that we're experiencing a lot of new interest in hunger and poverty among religious congregations, and especially among young people, people in their 20s. So I'm looking forward to Bread for the World using this book. McGovern and Dole and Messer are convinced that we can end hunger in our time. And one of the great attractions of this book is that it shows that this is not a liberal issue or a conservative issue. It's a red, white, and blue issue. And this book then puts it together in a way that is especially friendly for people of faith. It is my great honor first to introduce Senator George McGovern.
Well, thanks to everyone who has come out to meet with us today. Some years ago, many years ago, there was an English essayist by the name of Hilary Belloc, and he arrived at a meeting in London one night expecting to hear a renowned speaker, whereupon the chairman of the meeting announced that the renowned speaker had been delayed and would not be able to keep that commitment. But he said, I see our old friend Hilary Belloc in the audience. I'm going to ask him if he won't come up and speak to you tonight. As he got to the platform, Belloc said, what would you like me to speak on? And the chairman says, anything that you wish. You can discuss any, except two. We have a rule in this club, no discussion of religion or politics. Belloc says, whereupon, having been denied the opportunity to speak on the two concerns that most concern mankind, I turned on my heel and departed. Bob Dole and Don Messer and I have tried to combine both religion and politics in this book, a very dangerous combination in some quarters, but we believe that there's a common ground among people of a religious nature and those of us working in the field of politics, and that is the necessity of putting an end to human hunger. There are some divisions in the churches on certain theological questions, but I think even the so-called evangelical, the fundamentalists, the born-again Christians can find common ground with the mainline churches, and synagogues, and mosques, and Buddhist temples on the issue of hunger. I don't think there's a major religion in the world that doesn't command its adherents to feed the hungry, whether you're talking about Judaism, or Christianity or the Muslim or the Buddhist faith or the others. And so this book attempts to make the case morally and politically for accelerating the effort to put an end to hunger in the world. If you don't think that's the major problem for most of the people in the so-called developing world across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and parts of the Middle East, just go without eating anything but maybe a little dish of gruel once a day, and ask yourself at the end of 30 days, what is of most concern to you? And you'll discover that hunger is at the top of the list. Especially in Africa today, it might be AIDS, which is not as big a killer as malnutrition and hunger, but a tragic development in the lives of human beings. Marshall Matz, who was the legal counsel for the Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, he held that post for a while, as did Jerry Cassidy, who now runs perhaps the biggest public relations firm in Washington. They took turns guiding us legally through the intricacies of malnutrition and nutrition, the positive side of this issue. And Bob Dole and I was the chairman of that committee, and he was the ranking Republican. We worked together on the domestic hunger and malnutrition problems in the United States. This was something of a political miracle, because at the time I ran for president in 1972, Bob was the Republican national chairman. He used to take a bite out of me every morning before breakfast. I thought he was just about the meanest guy in American politics, and he probably thought the same thing about me. I remember one day after the campaign, I was going over to the Senate floor, and I remembered something I was supposed to have done first, and I just ducked into the first door that I saw open in the Senate office building. It was Spiro Agnew's vice presidential office, and I spoke to one of the secretaries there and asked if I could use the telephone. She said, "Why don't you go in and use the vice president's office? He's not here right now." So I walked in, and I sat down at that big desk, and here was a banner on the wall: "Will Rogers never met George McGovern." So I realized where I stood with the high command, but Bob Dole and I found that we had a common ground. It wasn't simply because we came from farm states and were looking for a way to dispose of farm surpluses, although that was a legitimate common ground. Nothing wrong with doing well while you're doing good. But we also had a concern about domestic hunger in this country. And we worked for about 10 years in a bipartisan way on that committee in the United States Senate. We doubled the school lunch program, introducing free and reduced price lunches. We doubled the food stamp program. We introduced a new program called WIC for low-income pregnant and nursing mothers and their infants through the age of 5. It got to the point where if the Democrats were then in the majority, so my name came first, but if a bill was introduced in the Senate, or an amendment that was called the McGovern-Dole bill or the McGovern-Dole amendment, it would go through with a hoop and a holler. Nobody voted against us, and we've carried that same bipartisan approach to the international hunger problem, and that's what this book is all about. How, with the United States in the lead and working through the United Nations, more specifically, hey Bob, I'm just talking about you, and in a most favorable way. Anyway, Bob and I have been partners in dealing with this problem of hunger, both in this country and abroad, for a long time, and I'm glad he's here today. Don Messer, I've known for many years. He was the president of the little liberal arts college where I went to school many years ago, Dakota Wesleyan, and then became president of the Iowa Seminary. But he has helped meld together the views of Bob and me in this little book. I learned today that the first printing's already been sold out, even though this is our first public recognition of the book. About 10,000 copies have already sold, and others. I have the feeling this book's going to be a big bestseller, because I think the churches and the synagogues are going to get behind it, and I hope it'll have some significant impact on winning public support. One area, I'm going to stop here and turn this back to David Beckman, who's been one of the great leaders in this field on hunger. But one area where I'm very impressed with the Bush administration, and that's what they're doing on the AIDS problem overseas. This country's put up $1 billion a year, isn't it, Don, on the AIDS fight? That's a very substantial amount of money, some $5 billion. It's the major effort that's being made. Then that's been supplemented by Bill Gates and his program and other private endeavors. But one thing we've learned about AIDS is that these wonder drugs, which enable you to live even with AIDS, as witness Magic Johnson, the only way those drugs work is if the person has adequate nutrition. It doesn't do much good, apparently, to administer these expensive drugs if the person's undernourished. So these two things go hand in hand. They're the two big killers, especially in Africa, AIDS and malnutrition. So I'd like to see this program of the McGovern Dole International School Lunch and Child Nutrition. I'd like to see that build up to about $300 million a year from the United States, and with other countries helping out too. If we do that, we can produce healthy youngsters, well-fed youngsters, and we can combat AIDS because they've had adequate diets. So these two have to go together, and that's what Bob and I are trying to do, and Don Messer and David Beckman and others. The great thing about the hunger problem is that it's soluble. I don't know whether I used to think world peace was the #1 problem, but people have been killing each other ever since Cain and Abel, and we probably are not going to see the end of human conflict. But hunger is something we can do. We can put an end to this, and so I hope everybody will read this book, and we'll tell you how it should be done. Thanks a lot.
I was just looking for this passage. I wasn't planning to read it, but it's my favorite passage in the book. It's from Senator McGovern's essay. He says, now that I am 83 years old, I do not expect to see the end of world hunger, unless the good Lord extends my years beyond 100. But I do intend to complain loudly to St. Peter if I am called above, or raise the devil if I'm called below, before we end hunger in America. I also expect to see us reach well past the end of the beginning of our victory over world hunger. Wherever I am in the world beyond, if such there be, when my fellow humans are finally emancipated from hunger, I'm going to lead a chorus of celebration. Alleluia, alleluia. Isn't that great? This is, the hunger issue is not, when Senator Dole and Senator McGovern appear together, it is so heartening and makes us feel good, and we think about the wonderful things that they did over the years. But this is a current issue. Decisions are being made right now about national priorities, decisions about what is the relative priority of people suffering with AIDS in developing countries or hungry people in our own country. This year, Bread for the World is campaigning against a proposed cut in the food stamp program that would take food stamps away from welfare to work moms. And we are campaigning for the Hunger-Free Communities Act, which is thankfully a bipartisan effort to get a more serious commitment, a commitment from this Congress to reduce hunger and food insecurity in America, and it would do some things to low-cost things to strengthen the impact of the nutrition programs. And Senator Bob Dole endorsed this effort right at the beginning, just as we were starting. So his name has been on the campaign since the beginning. It's allowed us to go into lots and lots of churches across the country and ask people to write Congress about this issue. And we started from nothing, but we're now up to really strong co-sponsor lists in both the House and the Senate. I think we have a good chance to actually pass the Hunger-Free Communities bill before the end of the year. So it's with a very current sense of gratitude that I introduce Senator Bob Dole.
Well, thank you very much, and I apologize for being late. I was in New York earlier this morning, and you never know whether you're going to make it out of there on time, but we did. So, and I'm not certain quite what's been said, but I want to thank Don and David and my good friend George McGovern, and we are friends. People kind of wonder how we get along, and well, I guess maybe we're both from the Midwest, both have a little common sense, both are part of the greatest generation, and in fact, George did most of his flight training in the state of Kansas. My parents are Democrats and his are Republicans, so that's figure that one out. But in any event, I don't know what has been said, but I'm very proud to be a part of this effort, and I always say right up front that I'm the #1 man is seated on my left. I mean, Senator McGovern has been the leader. I've been a bit player over the years, and because I think it is important that whatever we do be bipartisan, and I've always thought that word had a pretty good, resonated quite well with the American people, regardless of their politics, and so does the word compromise. I'm even reminded of President Reagan saying, if I can't get 100%, I'll take 70%, I'll take 80%, I'll get the rest later. And much of what Senator McGovern's been able to forge through the years has been a result of compromise, bring on bipartisan support, because it was my experience in the 35.5 years I spent in the Congress that you can force feed something, you can force it down the other party's throat, but if it's going to stay down and really mean anything, it needs broad bipartisan support. Just like the vote on Roberts this morning, I guess, was 78 to 22, which is strong bipartisan support. So, and I think there's been a need. I don't remember when George and I we had our debates and our differences and things of that kind, but we need to bring the Congress and the people back a little more civility and less confrontation. And David, that's how we'll get some of these problems addressed. But hunger is both a domestic and an international issue, and we have a responsibility in both areas. We have a history of dealing with this problem through the school feeding and WIC programs, and one of the reasons both Senator McGovern and I teamed up to initiate global school feeding program, because we had success in the United States. And of course, we still have problems in the United States. We talk about hunger around the world. We still have millions of young people who probably don't get enough to eat each day. And hunger is not a red, white, and blue state issue. It's not a red and blue issue. It's a red, white, and blue issue. And feeding the hungry is not the only morally right thing to do. It is also the pragmatic thing to do, with implications for emerging markets, education, and the standard of living for millions of people. And one thing that always sort of amused me in the days that George and I were in the Senate doing some of these things, that we were always, there are people who never give you any credit for having a pure motive, and there's all, well, this is helping the farmers in Kansas and South Dakota. That's why Dole and McGovern are spending all this money on these different food programs, which was really not true at all. At least I never had any farmers say, I hope you vote for the food stamp program. Maybe George did, but so what's more, in battling hunger, combating hunger goes hand in hand with another grave problem, and Senator McGovern just mentioned that, combating AIDS. And as he also pointed out, unless people are fed, no amount of medication will work on these people. Their bodies require nourishment in order for the drugs to work, and food must go hand in hand with medical treatment. And finally, ending hunger will be a tremendous ally in combating terrorism and avoiding an environment conducive to terrorism. And what we need to do is, with this, maybe this book will be of some help, is create the will to do all these things. I think we know what the problem is. We've been talking about the problems for decades and decades and decades. World hunger has been with us for a long, long time. But we've never had the will, and I think Senator McGovern is right. If we can get $300 million level U.S. contribution, that feeds how many? 9 million?
At least that.
At least 9 million young people, particularly young women, young girls, will go to school, have a meal, and do much better all the way around. And that's what the goal is. We need to bring in other countries. Obviously, we cannot do it alone in the United States, but we're spending a lot of money, and it seems to me that, that there ought to be enough room in any budget to take care of those in the United States and do our share around the world in feeding the hungry. Thank you.
I think Don Messer's done us a real service by pulling together essays and interviews with Senator McGovern, Senator Dole, his own essays, putting it in a format that'll really be friendly for ordinary people and for local congregations. Don Messer was the president of Dakota Wesleyan University, which is Senator McGovern's alma mater. Senator McGovern still lives part of every year there. And Don is now teaching at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver. He's teaching theology, and he's also teaching about the churches and global AIDS. Don Messer.
Thank you for coming, and thank you, David. It's a great honor to be associated with Senator Dole and Senator McGovern. In the course of this book project, I discovered how George McGovern and John the Baptist are similar, and Bob Dole and the Dalai Lama are similar. Read in the book from the Gospel of Luke, John the Baptist was asked how to deal with hunger, and he said, share. Share your coat, share your food. The Dalai Lama was recently asked how to solve the problem of world hunger, and he said simply one word, share. That's the message of Bob Dole and George McGovern, that we are called upon to share. There's enough food in the world for everyone. Political leaders since the days of Richard Nixon have been telling us that we have the capability of delivering this food if we're willing to do it, if we create the political will and we mobilize compassion without borders, we can make the food available to hungry people. Senator Dole and Senator McGovern have outlined the kinds of issues which are addressed in the book. There's a new urgency to this old challenge. We can no longer accept the moral, religious, and political scandal of having food and not sharing it with the hungry people of the world. We must mobilize, as the late Pope told us, widespread public opinion to make this happen. Nothing is more crucial, as both senators have noted, than to link HIV, AIDS, and hunger together. Food security is the best way to ensure education, prevention, care, and treatment of HIV, AIDS in this world. Recently, I returned from Kenya, and I'm pleased to report I went not as a representative of any government organization, but I'm pleased to report that I saw antiretroviral drugs from President Bush's PEPFAR program actually being delivered. I saw food from the World Food Program actually being administered. And I saw them being administered together, which is the key issue. Doctors near Eldoret in western Kenya were delivering 2 prescriptions to persons who came and were tested and discovered to have HIV. One, a prescription for the antiretroviral drugs, which were given to them free there. And second, a prescription for food, because you have to have food to take the drugs. If you give a woman, however, food, and she has no husband, probably already died of AIDS, she will give that food to her children. So the prescriptions are also given for food for the children. So we saw there in that one place a miracle being transformed. Lazarus is walking again. I met people on the streets of Eldoret who are now getting food and getting medicine, being trained to raise food now, become productive citizens. So I believe if we have the political will, if we mobilize the compassion, if we draw upon all the resources, we can make this a real movement to end hunger now. This is not simply a Christian effort. This has to be an effort that we move as an interfaith community. In Kenya, I saw Muslims working side by side with Methodists and with Anglicans and Catholics together, reaching out in humanitarian ways. I saw in Thailand in June Buddhists and Christians working together. An abbot had turned a Buddhist temple into a new place to provide economic employment for women and to make sure people had food. So together, we hope that as a people of God, whether we call ourselves Muslim or Catholic or Buddhist or Methodist or Lutheran or whatever, that we will work together to end hunger now, and in so doing, we will make an impact on the world. So thank you very much for coming, and we hope this book will have some impact in mobilizing that political will and religious compassion that's desperately needed in our world. Thank you.
I want to say, just as a practical matter, where we're experiencing the most new energy around hunger and poverty organizing is, in fact, among conservative evangelical Protestants, organized Judaism, and U.S. Islam, and then also among people in their 20s generally. Those are, so it's in, these 3 people are all United Methodists. You know, that United Methodists have been on this for a long time. But we're now seeing the Southern Baptists and the Assemblies of God and Reformed Judaism and the Islamic Society of North America and Bono and Brad Pitt. So I'll recognize people for questions. You can direct your questions to any of the 3 authors. Yes?
Very simple question. It might be in the book, but I know that. What are the greatest hurdles? What are the greatest challenges to moving forward?
Why don't you pick your, or who wants, Senator Dole?
I think I mentioned it as I closed. I think it's political will. I think we have the food. We certainly have the money in the world to do it. We have the supplies to do it. We need to have the will to get it done. Senator McGovern outlines in the book sort of a 10-point program that would do this. But I think in response to your question, I think we just need this. This is what we're trying to do here, to energize people, to get people interested, take it back to their churches, synagogues, mosques, whatever, and let's go to work.
Yes?
How did the idea for the book come about, and how did you all work together as collaborators?
Who wants
George?
to take that one?
How did we work together?
The ministry and the senator working closely together. But how did you work together on the book? And how did the idea come about?
Oh, well, we worked with Don Messer, who did most of the work on the book. And what we'd made statements in the past, and he had pretty good, well, particularly Senator McGovern had a regular library of all the things he's done. Mine was just a couple of books, and some of them weren't filled in. But well, George had volumes of things that he's done, and that's how Don, I think, Don, you'd have to answer the question, how you got it all together.
Senator McGovern approached me one day in Mitchell, South Dakota, Dakota Wesleyan, and said he was eager to get the churches more deeply involved in the current crisis of food, and asked me for some ideas. And out of those discussions emerged the idea of the book, and asked if possibly we could recruit Senator Dole to contribute, and he graciously responded. I was telling my wife, Bonnie, that this book was written without a contract most of the time, till just recently. It was written, in South Dakota we do things the shake of a hand. I think probably in Kansas, I'm not sure we even had a shake of the hand. We just did it on faith, and great cooperation from both senators and Senator Dole's office, and especially Fortress Press, who put a lot of faith in this project.
Yes.
Some of our trading partners have criticized the McGovern-Dole school lunch and food aid generally is interfering with markets. Would you respond, either both senators respond to that criticism?
Could people hear that?
No.
So some of our trading partners have criticized the McGovern-Dole school lunch program, other food aid, as interfering with free trade and agriculture. Would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think Senator McGovern could probably respond more fully, but I think that's something we've been very sensitive about, at least I have. If you've got an emerging market in some poor country, the last thing you want to do is to kill it, you know, with gifts of food that probably destroy that potential. So in my view, and George would be the expert on that, I think we're sensitive to that, and we understand the need for markets in these countries. If they're ever going to develop, they have to have a marketplace.
My introduction to that problem began when I was directing the Food for Peace program for the United States back in the early 60s. And we were under congressional guidelines that made us be careful not to do precisely what has just been raised as a concern, not to unload food in countries where it disrupted their local producers, local sales, and that same guideline prevails today. Early on in the Food for Peace program, there were cases where this unfortunate development took place. For example, in Japan, we don't think today of Japan as a country that needs food assistance, but they did after World War II. A lot of that country was destroyed. A lot of its productive capacity was destroyed. So the American Food for Peace program moved into Japan in a big way. And we discovered it was killing the market for Burma, which had rice for sale. They'd been unloading rice in the commercial markets in Japan for years. And American Food for Peace programs disrupted that Burmese market. And so we learned a lesson there. We didn't want to alienate Burma, and we didn't want to be unfair to them, so we drew back until we could work out that problem. The World Food Program, that's its official name, the World Food Program of the United Nations, in my opinion, is one of the best run of the UN agencies. Some of them are pretty heavily loaded on the bureaucratic side, but not the World Food Program. It was run for about 10 years by a remarkable woman by the name of Catherine Bertini. She was appointed by the senior President Bush, and she was so good that after her 5-year term was over, President Clinton, who was then president, named her for another 5 years. Now we have a man by the name of Jim Morris from Indiana, who was appointed by President Bush, the junior president, and he's every bit as good as Catherine Bertini. He's a terrific administrator and is doing a great job. The World Food Program has experienced, trained people in 80 different countries. Got field offices all out across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and they know what they're doing. They know how to run a school lunch program so it's free of the black market, free of diversion, other than for the children it's intended. So I think I can give you a pretty strong assurance that these feeding programs are very well run. You agree with that, David? David Lambert here.
Could I just add one thing, George? One thing that we've been working on, I know David has, and that's to buy some of this food in country.
Exactly.
Now that sparks a little debate on Capitol Hill, as you might guess, with people from farm states, but I don't think it's I don't think they have a good argument. If you want to help that market and also help the people, we ought to spend some of that money in that country.
Yeah. Some countries don't have surplus food to contribute, so they put up cash, and you can use that to buy fruits and vegetables and other things that it's difficult for us to export because of the perishable nature of the. We've also encouraged every school that has a school lunch program overseas to plant gardens around that school. And that's a good way for people to supplement their local diets. It's a worthy skill to teach the children how to plant carrots and beets and peas and beans and all those things. David,
we used to do it.
Beckman,
we did it in Russell, Kansas.
Yes, the young lady there. You.
Thank you very much for bringing this issue back on the table in the way that you've done in your book. And, you know, when it comes to HIV/AIDS, I think we can look at food as a prevention strategy, because some of the women and girls who are vulnerable to HIV infection, it's because of poverty and hunger that they expose themselves to HIV/AIDS. And I was just wondering whether you've been talking more and finding out, because hunger is a symptom of poverty. It's a symptom of systems that have failed. And I'm just wondering whether you've been discussing how do you address the root causes of hunger? How do you address the unequal distribution of resources in a country? How do you address, you know, corruption in the countries where they are not able to feed their own people? How do you address trade policies that actually create inequality in a country? So I was just wondering whether you've been dealing with that and how do we go? Because if we don't address that, we'll keep on seeing more and more people become hungry every day here in the United States and all over the world.
Don, do you want to take the lead on that one?
Well, I have to say our book is more modest than, doesn't quite answer all of those questions that are critical and key. The book is more designed to motivate and stimulate these kinds of discussions. But I think we do see that a greater accountability being requested of governments for the funds that are being invested, and we see that being very important. You also see more closer work with the United Nations and the countries involved in the distribution of the food. Clearly, poverty and hunger are both the cause and the consequence of HIV/AIDS. I mean, there's no doubt that people get the disease because they're hungry. They move to more urban slum areas where they're more prone to be able to get the disease in certain countries. Many women have to engage in survival sex in order to feed their families. Many, many problems are really caused by poverty itself. So the whole Millennium Goals effort of the United Nations, the whole efforts that the current administration, previous administration have been working on are critical.
Bread for the World does work on a range of issues to help reduce poverty, because it is true that trade policy, development assistance, debt relief, the policies of governments that allow people to earn a decent living, that's the most durable way to reduce hunger is a decent job. That's true in this country and it's true around the world. At the same time, programs of food assistance, nutrition assistance can accelerate progress. So even at any level of poverty, you can make sure the kids at least have enough to eat. So, yeah. Ray?
The purpose of the book is to stimulate more involvement with the religious groups around the U.S. What is the #1 strategy to get more involvement?
Well, we're trying to sell the idea that this is a soluble problem. We need more support for it. We need a bigger appropriation from the Congress. We need more participation in private giving through the churches and other philanthropic groups. With regard to this question that we've just talked about, the larger problem of poverty and everything that goes with that, one of the beauties of this school lunch program is that it does reach in. It's not the total cure for poverty, but I've had people say to me, George, you know, until we get population under control, I think it's hopeless to try to get on top of the problems of poverty and hunger. Well, if you get these little girls into school, even if it's only the first 6 grades, the United Nations studies show some remarkable things. An illiterate girl who doesn't go to school, and there are about 120 million of those in the developing world, they start getting married at the age of 10, 11, 12, 13. You know all these things. They have an average of 6 children for each little illiterate mother. The ones that go to school, even if it's only the first 6 grades, they marry later in life. They have a better sense of what life is all about. They're not as easy for men and boys to push around. They have an average of 2.9 children. You slightly more than cut in half the population rate. So that's a big contribution to reducing poverty in the world if you don't have so many people scrambling for too few resources. Another thing that happens is that when you start one of these school lunch programs, whether it's in Zambia or Nigeria or Colombia, wherever it is, you greatly increase the enrollment in schools. And the girls come as well as the boys. And furthermore, their academic performance goes up. And you just improve the general educational level in any country that has these school lunch programs operating. That's happened in this country. I had the dean of the University of Georgia tell me many years ago that the federal program that had done the most to encourage the economic and social development of the South was the federal school lunch program. Pulling these kids into school, increasing their vigor and their energy and their education. I think it's true in these developing countries. So we don't have a cure-all for poverty, but we make a contribution in producing healthy kids.
There are some more questions, but I think we should wrap it up, and I'd like to give the last word to Beth Lewis. She's the president and CEO of Augsburg Fortress Publishing Company. They are the folks who brought this great book to us. Thank you very much. Thanks to Senator Dole, McGovern, Don Messer, and to all of you for being here. Beth Lewis.
Well, we are delighted. Thank you. We're delighted, of course, to have these wonderful authors gracing our presence, gracing us with their presence today. And we so appreciate your putting this on your busy calendars as well. This is important work that they do. Augsburg Fortress is the Ministry of Publishing within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. We have Methodist authors. We are an ecumenical publisher serving an international community. Now we can add bipartisan to that laundry list. We do welcome your staying and chatting casually, having your books signed, enjoying some of the refreshments in the back of the room. And we especially would appreciate anything each of you can do to help us get this important message out through linking to our website, endinghungernow.org, through inviting these wonderful authors to speaking engagements, and to joining the community of faith, the interfaith community that's using our website to connect and to help one another in terms of networking on this critical issue. Thank you again for joining us today.
Yeah, I thought I was going to miss it.
Ending Hunger Now, A Challenge to Persons of Faith, is published by Fortress Press. Visit fortresspress.org for more information.